much. I'm going to hand over to Olivia. Thanks so much, Olivia.
Thanks, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Olivia Boutwood. I'm a Benefits Associate at Morgan Stanley and sit within the Health and Benefits team, and I am responsible for our global wellbeing strategy and also oversee the preventative care benefits across EMEA. I'm also on the Thriving from the Start committee. I joined in August last year, and as hopefully many of you know, the Thriving from the Start network is a mental health community for those who are in their early careers or who are still in education but applying for jobs. And today we are going to be discussing the importance of setting boundaries to support positive mental health, both professionally and in personal lives. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. We invest huge amounts of time and energy into the work. So kind of understanding those feelings of overwhelm, may it be through anxiety, imposter syndrome, or perfectionism, is so crucial. And I'm delighted to have to be joined by a wonderful set of panelists today. So we have Will Banks from the Bank of England, we have Mel Atwood from Louis Vuitton, and John Binns, MBE. I will let our panelists introduce themselves properly later on. So before we dive into the panel, I actually just want to run through some housekeeping rules. I wanted just to highlight that this session is being recorded and that there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So please do submit questions throughout this panel discussion using the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the Zoom. But I'm now going to hand over to our panelists. And Will, I wanted to come to you first. Please, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hi, Olivia. Great to see you, and thanks very much for having me today. So my name's Will. As Olivia said at the start, I'm an analyst at the Bank of England, and I started here in 2020. So I've been here coming up for 3 years now, although it doesn't feel that long at all. I also know Olivia already because I'm also a member of the Thriving from the Start committee and joined that again around 3 years ago. So yeah, very glad to be here today.
Thank you. So you've talked about joining the Bank of England virtually during the pandemic. What was this like?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned 3 things in your intro there, Olivia. You mentioned imposter syndrome, you mentioned anxiety, and you mentioned perfectionism. And those, I guess, are the 3 key words of kind of looking back at my first year in my job for kind of the themes that emerged and the things that I struggled with mentally. So I should say I started in September 2020, so not in the initial height of the pandemic, but at a stage where the office still wasn't open, and joining and starting my first ever full-time job from my bedroom rather than from like the really cool office was a very weird feeling. In a lot of ways, I still really enjoyed the work, still found my kind of role fascinating, but I think being remote kind of set me off on the wrong foot in a few different ways. So the first thing, and this is something we've spoken about at previous Thriving from the Start events, was I already had a bit of a sense of imposter syndrome. So my role, like many of those across the city, get kind of a huge number of applicants. So I had a little bit of a feeling of, oh, I'm very lucky to be here. I maybe don't really deserve to get this job. Maybe it was just chance that I've been offered it. So I started off from a place of feeling quite insecure in my position in the role, and that was only really exacerbated by being virtual. I think kind of not knowing my colleagues, who all generally knew each other because they'd worked together in person before, really heightened that feeling of there was some core group of people at work who did deserve to be here and were amazing, and then there was me sticking out like a sore thumb that kind of everyone didn't really know. And one of the results of that kind of that constant feeling of not quite belonging, or maybe like there being a risk I was going to be caught out, whereas I was extremely anxious and extremely keen to make a good impression on people. So I've always been a bit of a people pleaser, but I think working remotely really exacerbated my perfectionism. I kind of didn't have those opportunities to meet people casually or talk about non-work related stuff. So I felt all they knew about me was the output they were getting, you know, the emails I was sending, the analysis that I was doing. And so I became really keen to ensure that that was kind of as good as it could possibly be, and that I was getting on the kind of starting off on the right foot. I think that kind of all tied back to boundary setting, in that I essentially didn't feel I was in a place where I could set boundaries. I kind of got into the bad habit of saying yes to every bit of work that I was asked to do, regardless of the cost to me, whether that was stress or, you know, working longer hours to meet the deadlines. And I think slowly over time, over kind of the first couple of years of my career, that just built and built. As I kept working here, more and more topics came up that I agreed to be leading on. And I think over time that became unsustainable. But I was still really keen to appear as though everything was absolutely fine and I was doing really well. Because as I said, I didn't want to look like I stood out too much or look like, or kind of reveal that I didn't belong in the workplace. And for me, that had a really protracted and negative impact on my mental health. So I found that my baseline level of stress was quite high, and especially working remotely, I didn't really have a boundary between work and home. So as I logged off, I would still take all of these issues in my head with me. And looking back at me kind of 2 years ago, I wish I could say to myself, you know, it's absolutely fine for you to say no, and it will be healthier in the long run. In the end, my anxiety reached a point where I was taking quite frequent days off work to kind of cope, and that in turn made my anxiety worse about needing to take on more work. So there was a bit of a vicious cycle there. I think as I've returned to the office, and as I've kind of got more experienced in the role, some of this has subsided. And part of that is because I've realized this is a common problem across everyone, not just across the cohort that I was in 2020. A lot of people where I work, but also in other jobs in the city, I think have that sense that they need to be saying yes to everything. And that is kind of what they're paid for, what they're meant to do. But I think thinking longer term, thinking, you know, 5-10 years ahead, is really important to try and say no when you think it's sensible to do so, and obviously to do that in a constructive way, but it means that you're able to work longer, that you don't need to take as much time off work, and also that you'll generally be happier, which is obviously the main goal.
Exactly, and I think your point around when you're working virtually and not kind of next to your colleagues, it's really hard for them to understand, you know, how much you're working on kind of the tasks that you're doing. So I think that's a really interesting point that you've made. So how have you established boundaries? And I'm kind of particularly interested in kind of the social setting here as well.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll talk a little bit more about kind of what I've changed in the work environment first. So unfortunately, I think one thing that's helped me to set boundaries has been kind of becoming more experienced. I've moved into a slightly different role to the one I started in. And I kind of feel as though now that I've got that slightly different title, although my job is essentially the same, that kind of gives me the authority to say no a little bit more. And I think it's really important in the workplace to be clear to new joiners, to interns, apprentices, that actually you don't need to have been promoted to be allowed to say no. And it's a real strength of junior people if they can say no to work and manage their workload actively. It makes things easier for managers, and it kind of, you know, is going to set them on a better foot for the rest of their career. I think there are maybe 3 other things in a work setting that have really helped me. So that's wellbeing support from my employer, developing a bit of a peer group, and then also my relationship with my manager. So on wellbeing support, my workplace made counselling available to me, which I then took. And as part of that counselling, we discussed setting boundaries quite a lot. And, you know, explored some of the deeper reasons as to why I was maybe struggling to set some of those boundaries. I think that's something that all workplaces could be doing to ensure that their employees have a sensible and healthy approach to their work. The second is the peer group. I think meeting all of my graduate cohort in person and getting to know them better, firstly, gave me a bit of a sense of solidarity. You know, I'm not the only one here that feels a little bit out of place or like a fish out of water, and that provided some comfort. And then thirdly, and I think this is a really important recommendation for businesses, is my manager has been really proactive with me and encouraging me to set boundaries. I think I'm really lucky in that regard. We had a conversation last year where essentially her feedback for me was, you're doing really well, but you really need to start saying no to things. And getting that explicit permission from someone more senior who I obviously look up to greatly, to be setting those boundaries and to look after my mental health has really transformed my work life. So yeah, that's what I'd say on the business side.
Thank you. And then and so if we move kind of away from the business side and more into kind of your social setting, I'd be interested to hear kind of your experience and how you've established boundaries outside of work.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's some similarities with what I was just saying with like how I was thinking on the business side. So again, in my social life, I think I get into a bit of a vicious cycle of saying yes to things. So again, I'm generally a fairly anxious person, and the reason I tend to say yes to every plan that is made is that I have this real fear of missing out on something. This kind of fear that other people have more busy, more engaging, more exciting lives that I should be trying to keep up with. I think in particular that's exacerbated by social media, right? It's very easy to see whatever people are putting. For me, it's Instagram. For others, it might be different platforms. To see what people are putting on there and realizing, they're out, so I should be too. I think I then kind of say yes to absolutely everything. My weeks fill up. I will, be busy every weeknight and all weekend. And that will get me to a point where I'm so exhausted that I need to start cancelling plans to kind of make some time for myself. And that can in turn make the fear of missing out and make the anxiety a little bit worse. So there's a bit of a vicious cycle there. I think what I often try to remind myself is that everybody does have downtime. It's just less visible. So no one, is putting anything on social media to say, I'm taking a night off and sitting in and watching a film or, whatever it is they're doing to relax. But I think, speaking to my friends about this, I realized that often people do feel the same, and they feel like they should always be going, but actually scheduling in downtime to relax and just enjoy yourself in a non-social setting is really valuable. One trick that I've kind of picked up on this side is I realized essentially if my calendar had an empty spot in it, I would fill it with a social plan. So I now very proactively block out random days into the future where I say, that looks like quite a busy week at work, or that's a bit busy week socially. This evening, I'm going to block it out in my calendar just to have time for myself. And it seems like a simple trick, right? But I do genuinely look at my calendar, see that day is busy and say, sorry, I'm not free. So that's one way that, I've tried to start setting boundaries, although, I'm still not perfect in that regard, for sure.
I think that's a really good trick, and I think definitely one that I'll be taking away following this discussion. And I think you talk so well about the need to not just set boundaries in your professional life, but also your personal life, because they are so intertwined and linked. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that. We know that this is not an issue kind of unique to the finance sector. So Mel, I want to bring you into the discussion at this point. I think you're in an entirely different industry, and we know it's a universal issue. So really, really interested to hear your thoughts. Please, could you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, of course. Well, hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you so much for attending. So my name is Mel, and I've been working at Louis Vuitton for 1.5 years now, and I'm an HR advisor. So I do kind of a generalist role, HR payroll, talent management, recruitment. So kind of a 360 role, which we'll discuss a bit later about managing all those different aspects. And recently, since last week, I've now been certified to become mental health first aider. So really excited to be part of that, and also support the CSR initiatives in the HR team to have a mental health and well-being initiatives, not just during mental health week like last week, but to have it throughout the year and to really have that part of our culture.
Thanks, Mel. It's great to hear about your certification. Congrats. So you started your role shortly after the pandemic. What was that like for you?
So just to give a bit of context, I did a master's, and my master's was virtual. So I think we had no in-person lectures. So it was a very strange time to be going to university and finishing your master's, but you still make the best out of the situation. And you make friends and you try to connect with your peers as much as you can. So really during this period of time, for at least 1 year, apart from my family and my friends, my circle was really small. And then after I finished my dissertation, got the job. And also I had never worked in an office before. I had a few internships, but it was either remote or like in summer camps or teaching. So it was very different to work in an office, and so it was very different. So the idea of not worked in an office before, working in an environment where, apart from interacting with the people that are close to you, and then starting in a role 5 days a week was very daunting, very anxious. But with anxiety, you learn that you got to push through to keep going. And so, first week was very daunting, meeting so many people, having to remember all the names. And also because you had just come out of COVID and just being in your social circle. But at the end, you know, you get the hang of it and now 100% comfortable. But I think it was definitely an adjustment, and you just had to keep going and kind of push for your fears, I'd say.
Thank you. We've talked about kind of being in HR and having multiple stakeholders, and you being in the retail industry, and you know it's really difficult to switch off. It's a very constant stream of kind of traffic. How do you manage to set boundaries within the workplace?
No, that's a very good question and an important one, because we work in retail. I mean, it's 7 days a week. So Monday to Sunday. So even though, you know, I work Monday to Friday, you know, still want to be you're a support function at the end of the day for your retail teams, and you want to be here in case of a problem. But at the end of the day, you need to switch off, because every day you bring baggage at home. And it's important you to have a good night's sleep, have a good, you know, healthy, balanced diet, everything, because the next day you need to let go of everything so that you can start your day fresh. And so that's why it's important to let go, because if you have that also on the weekends, then it's going to be really hard to detach. So for me, I just turn it off. And maybe on a Sunday evening, I'll quickly check up, kind of catch up on everything, but switching off. And maybe also having that communication with your manager. Maybe one weekend, you know, you support me, one weekend I do, so that at least people get to rest and but also without affecting the business as well.
Thank you. And I guess it would be really interesting to hear how that's changed from when you first started. Kind of what was your way of working versus now you're much more experienced, and you've kind of found your feet in the role, and perhaps have set some of the boundaries you just mentioned. How has that changed? What has changed in your working style?
I mean, for sure, I think I was in a very bad habit before, where always on your phone. So we have a work phone and a personal phone. So, I mean, if you combine the screen times of both, I mean, I wouldn't want to share it right now. It was quite bad, but it's really important to switch off. So I think before I would come back from home and check my phone. And on the weekends I would check, during on holidays, and now it's really about, okay, I'm going to turn it off. And sometimes, as kind of Will mentioned, a bit of FOMO, you don't want to miss out. So it's also something to do with curiosity. But I said that, you know, because the last thing you want is looking at your phone and see a bad news that happened on a Saturday, and then it kind of ruins. And I feel like having that a few times where you hear bad news and it kind of ruins your weekend, you're like, no, I don't want that to keep happening. So really setting those boundaries. If I have to stay a bit later at work, to then turn off my phone when I get home, have a good night's sleep, I think it's really crucial. But it's I think with this day and age, with phones and everything, you got to have those boundaries for yourself. Otherwise you're gonna be consumed, and then you won't be able to let go with your luggage, as I said, and then start fresh the next day.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. You kind of talked about the never-ending emails. You're never going to be able to kind of clear your inbox. It's almost like your to-do list at work. It's never ending. And I think for me personally, that was one of the big transitions between education and the workplace. I remember at university, you kind of had a defined list of expectations. You knew when your exams were, you knew where your coursework deadlines were. But then as you move into the workplace, you've got this to-do list, which is ever evolving and kind of outside of your control. It's very much dependent on multiple stakeholders, your manager, your organization goals. So I think that's been a big focus for me in terms of shifting my mindset and how I view that. But thank you. It was really great to hear about kind of how this kind of is universal. It's not just in one sector, it affects everyone, and it will affect everyone slightly differently. John, I'd like to hear from you next, please. Can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes, I might take it just a little bit longer, if you don't mind, because I wanted to tell you a little bit about my personal experience.
Please do.
As well. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I mean, the important things I think to say is that for many years, I think it was 16 years, I was a partner in Deloitte. So very much in the kind of area of business that many of you are in. My interest in things to do with looking after our mental health, the question that we're posing today about setting boundaries, being there for the long term rather than the short term, came out of my own experience of getting into a very bad place about in the middle of that time when I was a partner, about halfway through, and getting into a point where I simply didn't recognize myself in the way that I was able to perform, my ability to be happy, to thrive in the environment I was working in seemed to have deserted me. I found my ability to make decisions about stuff seemed to have gone. My level of anxiousness about things which wouldn't normally make me anxious at all seemed to have gone through the roof. This was about 2010. We didn't really have a word for any of this at that point. We wouldn't be having this discussion at all that we're having today. I found myself in a situation where I was off sick for 3 months, and in the middle of that period, just thinking, that's it for you, John. There is no way you're ever going to go back and do what you've done before. Be happy, thrive, survive, be successful. But those thoughts weren't true, actually, and it's something we might come on to in the question. Your thoughts about the future and thoughts about what might happen are very often not as true as they seem in our heads at the time. And that thought for me that I wouldn't be able to get back and do what I'd done before wasn't true. And I did go back after that 3.5 months off, took up some of my all of my responsibilities eventually, but at a graduated return to picking those up. And for the next kind of 5 or 6 years, I was out there doing the things that I had done before, subject to the same pressures that I'd been subject to before. I can probably say hand on heart, because things tend to get measured in that kind of environment. I was as commercially successful as a partner as I'd been before that burnout or breakdown, as we call it now. I was actually happier as a partner in the time after that very bad place that I got into, principally because of some of the things that I learned from getting into that bad place. And I went on a bit of a mission in parallel with getting back on my horse, which was kind of plan A, to try and get businesses, starting with Deloitte, then through being a very early member of the City Mental Health Alliance, to think about mental health, to think about the need for boundaries, the need to look after ourselves. I became very close to Mind, the mental health charity, and I was on the board of Mind for 10 years, actually. Just finished that, because you can only do 3 sets of 3 years. Big change for me in my life. Just to bring it kind of up to date in terms of, where else I might get some insight in terms of perhaps asking your questions. There's what I learned from that experience. There's the things that I've learned from being part of Mind and on the board of the City Mental Health Alliance. And there's also the fact that I decided about 6 years ago to stop being a partner at Deloitte. I had kind of got back on my horse. I'd proved that to myself. I'd become very passionate about this whole area. And I took a CBT, a cognitive behavioural therapy based coaching qualification. CBT was really important in putting myself back together when I was in a bad place, but I felt I really needed an academic understanding of it if I was going to see people on a one-to-one basis. I'd been doing that as a mental health champion in a sort of amateur way for 6 or 7 years whilst a partner. I decided to take that up professionally. And since then, I've seen hundreds of people at all levels in the last 7 or 8 years across the city, from partners right to new joiners, typically suffering with some kind of stress-related reaction to the workplace, things that are going on around them in work. So I think I may have some insight from that as well. So it's a rather long introduction, but I think important just to set that territory.
Yeah, really important and really helpful. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's clear that you have a lot of experience. I guess my first question for you is, what do you wish that you knew at the start of your career, or what would you want others to know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. So I'll perhaps just a lot of things, actually, Olivia. I'll pick 1 or 2 out. I mean, perhaps one of the most important things to me was to recognise that resilience or well-being / happiness is rather different from endurance. So my approach to dealing with being put into difficult situations, to have things coming at me, as you've described, what can seem like an infinite amount of potential work to in an organisation like Deloitte, there's so much out there, was just to apply more endurance to it. And endurance is a great characteristic. I think it's something that I wouldn't want to knock, the ability to apply oneself. But you know what? I think when I look back at it, that was my only way of dealing with adversity or dealing with challenge. I will just push myself to try and get through it. And the thing that I learned, which actually, when you think about it, sports people learn, we all actually, if we think about it, know that endurance is finite for all of us. If that is what we bring to the one club, I'll get my analogies wrong here, but the one club in our kit bag or whatever that we use, then it will run out for everybody. And I was not kind enough to myself to say, actually, you know what, how are you feeling, John? And are there some other ways of exercising choice, thinking about what's important for you, thinking about what the boundaries are. So confusing endurance with resilience was one really big thing that I did wrong.
Thank you. I think I think that is so important, and I think it's so misunderstood, and especially when you come into the workplace, lots of people now are coming in through internships or apprentices, and it's a short period of time where, you know, it can quite easily become a culture where you've got a short amount of time, you need to say yes to everything, you need to prove yourself, you need to kind of establish a profile. So I think it's really important to kind of change that narrative.
It's quite interesting, those words you use there as well, need to, because perhaps the other thing that I learned was, and I really would want all of us to think about this, because I see it time and time again when I'm doing one-to-one work with people, is beware the words must, have to, can't, need. They are red flag words. They are words that are typically not as true as they seem, and they become a language that we use to ourselves and we use to others. I can remember thinking about when I was introduced to that concept, which is a CBT concept. It says, be careful about those words. They're typically not true. And if we tell ourselves something has to happen, that person must behave like this, I must do that, then we're creating, such an enormous consequence if the world doesn't turn out to do what we've said has to happen, or we don't manage to do what we've told ourselves has to happen. The impact on us emotionally is enormous and I was introduced to that concept, and I thought, you know what, when I was in a very bad place, and I thought, you know what, John, if someone had asked you to write down all the things that you must do to be a successful Deloitte partner, before I had that breakdown, I'd still be writing them down now. You must always go to that kind of meeting, say yes to that kind of work, do this. And I recognized that, I was probably adding 20 to 25% additional pressure by the stuff I told myself I had to do. And I began to exercise choice. I began to realize that I could exercise choice around some things that I may choose to do. And the consequence of that would be nowhere near as the thought in my head, what people would think, etc. And that's kind of how I started to navigate the world rather differently.
Thank you. I will take that one away. It's a good takeaway. What advice would you give to people who need help or want help in setting boundaries?
It depends when you talk about needing help. I mean, there's the best thing is talking to someone else about how they do it. Where you find that someone else, of course, depends on the situation that you're in. If you can be a little bit open with colleagues around you about the fact that you might be having difficulty with it, this kind of conversation that we're having actually can be a very ordinary conversation around, when everyone's having a sandwich for lunch, how do you do it? So recognizing that it's okay to have the conversation and to get tips from people is the first step. Don't have it in your own head. One of the things that I will often say is that we can't control the ingredients that go into the various columns of our life, whether it's rest and recovery, home, work, nutrition, exercise. We can't absolutely control what ingredients go in there. But you know what? We can very often influence them or choose them to a greater degree than our thoughts tell us. So I'd ask people to recognize that truth. The world often doesn't fall in when we exercise choice. And talking to friends, talking to colleagues, how do you do it, will expose the fact that it's normal, that we all need to think about this kind of stuff, that it's not a very personal issue that we've got. And out of that will come some of the solutions.
I think, you know, the having the conversation piece is so crucial, and I'm so glad that you've spoken about it. I'd be interested to understand from you what your kind of observation is. You've been quite open about your experience.
Yeah.
Have you and I think, you know, role modeling is so helpful in kind of in permissioning. Have you noticed anything here in the workplace, in, you know, those in their early careers using you as a mentor or speaking to you about setting boundaries and well-being in the workplace?
I mean, in terms of the difference, perhaps, do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that we have to be careful about, in the sense that there is clearly, when I look at it, progress. There is really significant progress. This conversation and this group of people would not exist and be having this conversation when I first decided to talk about my own experience. So we have moved on big time in that respect. However, it is no doubt the case, and it is still an issue. It is still an issue for many of us to feel comfortable to open up and get help in the workplace. What I would say is that, you know, if you were just doing a statistical, you know, what is the chance now that if one was to talk to a manager about perhaps the need to set some boundaries around the particular project that one's on, and what the chances of getting a more positive response are significantly higher than they would have been 10 years ago, but there's a way to go. I know that's not a perfect answer, but I think that's the truth. You know, there is a way to go, but things are moving in the right direction as a result of conversations like this.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. We want to open it up to the Q&A. So if you haven't yet submitted a question, please do use the Q&A box. Please submit your questions in there, and we will have an opportunity to ask those questions to all of our panelists today. We've had one come through, and I think this one's to all of the panelists. And the question is, what is one boundary that you set in your personal life? Will, I'm going to come to you first. I know you've touched on this earlier in our conversation, but is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, sure. So I would definitely advocate the calendar trick that I mentioned earlier. One other thing that I do, and it's very similar to what Mel was talking about with switching off her work phone. When I started during the pandemic, I got into the really bad habit of leaving my laptop on at my desk during the evenings, and I would go back to check it to see if I'd had any emails out of hours that maybe would impact my kind of next day. And I think as I've started going into the office, I've realized having a very clear dividing line, even if it means the next day is slightly busier or the current day is slightly busier, having that very concrete line between work and social life is really important. Pragmatically, I now try to leave my laptop in the office whenever it's possible, as long as I know I'm in the next day, so that even if I do get the kind of anxious thought of, oh, I need to know what someone has said about this note that I've written or this analysis I've done, it's physically not possible for me to do so. So kind of changing my environment to make it less likely that I'm going to blur that boundary, I think has been really helpful for me.
Thank you, Will. I definitely agree. I never thought I'd say it, but I really appreciate the commute, that physical boundary between kind of work and home. I'm going to come to John and you next, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think building on what Will said there, I mean, I think planning is really important. So to plan things that one is going to be doing, whether that's in the rest and recovery column or whether it's doing something social. And if one's trying to make sure that one continues to recognize the importance of things other than work, then contracting, it's a rather strong word, I don't really mean, but contracting with someone else to be somewhere, to do something, makes it a little bit harder to just blur more and more. So, you know, so that was one of the issues I think we really all faced during the pandemic. actually, where the lockdown kind of regulation made it hard to go and see someone. So it was easy for work to just take up the whole of the day. If you think about that, that's because there was no contract to go and see someone else or to go and do something else, because you kind of couldn't do it. So planning and making an arrangement doesn't mean you know that you are bound absolutely to do it. And of course, you know, there might be some times when it's not the right thing to do to go, but it makes it a little more difficult to divert back to the work if you've made a concrete arrangement to meet someone, be with someone, and you'll let them down. And, you know, for me, the specific thing there was, you know, if I play in a band, you might be surprised. No, what's he doing? But, you know, if band practice was on Tuesday night, they can't really have it if only half the people turn up, you know. So those kind of contracts where you know that you're letting someone down in another area of life can be a great way of setting a boundary and raising the importance of it versus work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And like you, I'm not in a band, but I do play tennis on a Monday, and everyone in my team knows about it. It's in my diary, and that's my my commitment, and I make sure that I go. Mel, any tips from you?
I would say mostly for my personal life is the weekend. So I see the weekend as cut in four. So morning and the afternoon on Saturday, and morning and the afternoon on Sunday, and that's where I'm able to kind of organize and plan, because it's also important to listen to your body and what your head wants, because sometimes you can find that when you're out with friends, maybe you want to be home watching a show. And then when you're home watching a show, you like, oh, maybe I should be out with friends. So I think it's really important to hear what you want. Maybe you've had a really intense week, and maybe you need to recharge if you're more introverted. And maybe if you're more extroverted, you want to speak about it. So it's important to reflect, understand what do I need, and like listen to yourself and find the balance between you know, doing your chores, having fun, and also recharging. And it's okay to have a Saturday all day at home and relaxing too, and not feeling bad about it. It's just about knowing yourself.
Thank you, Mel. Will, we've had a question for you. You mentioned earlier that no one was posting on Facebook when they're taking a break for their well-being. And kind of John's kind of touched on this as well, but would it have been helpful if managers or senior leaders had been more vocal about what they were doing to set boundaries and what they were doing to kind of protect their mental health and well-being?
Definitely. So I think role modeling has a really important place in helping younger people set boundaries. I think it can quite often feel when you start a job, particularly when you're kind of very new to a role, feels like the kind of senior people are working very long hours, they're constantly very busy, and they're stressed. So your role is to kind of do whatever you can to help them out. And you can kind of quite often slip into the pattern of working longer hours to kind of almost mimic the behaviors of other people. And I think where it's at all possible, having senior people in your work environment, role modeling, setting clear boundaries can be really, really helpful. So, for example, some things that have helped me within the workplace, kind of within my own team or within my kind of bit of the Bank of England, is my manager will be very clear on things that she is not going to do. And she'll kind of say that quite explicitly. She'll say, you know, it's been a busy week. I'm not going to stay on late to do this. I'm going to do it on Monday morning instead. That's obviously healthy for a manager to do anyway. But I think seeing things like that over time has really helped me realize that it's okay for me to do a similar thing. And just to emphasize, it doesn't have to come from within a kind of chain of command. When I was kind of working remotely, the only real social interaction I had at work was through our local wellbeing group. And there were kind of more senior people there from other bits of the bank who would talk about this and would say, you know, it can be very easy to get swept away in comments from seniors on bits of work. And I'm very keen to, you know, push back on that where I need to. The other role that I think senior people can play is helping people junior to them set boundaries for themselves. So I mentioned earlier, my manager's made it clear to me that, you know, she sees that I quite often don't say no to things, and she is kind of very proactive in helping me start to do that and start to set those boundaries. it can be easier for someone who's been in the role for longer to say, I don't think that this junior person needs to do this task, or I think we could maybe consider a longer timeline. So as proactive as managers can be with helping that, I think the better.
Thanks, Will. I think it's so important for managers to be proactive. And actually, we've had a question come through asking how and when is a good time to start a conversation with managers about boundary setting. So perhaps more targeted at those managers who aren't as proactive. So I'm going to open that question up to the group. Is there anyone who wants to talk about that?
I mean, one thought that I would have around that is that, you know, it's obviously it varies in terms of the culture and the leadership culture that exists in an organization. You know, when I talk to groups of managers, I am very much encouraging them to recognize that having conversations with people in their team about what's happening in that person's world is an absolutely appropriate business conversation. And unless their leaders are recognize that it is not their role only to talk about whatever the KPIs are for a particular, you know, what's the sales, what's the pipeline, what's the project risks, all very important stuff. But actually, how are you doing? What else have you got going on at the moment? What you know, what's up? Those kind of things are absolutely appropriate business conversations. And unless leaders normalize those conversations in the way I've just described, it is quite hard. So it is quite hard. And there has to be a kind of push as well as a pull, if you see what I mean. Without leaders normalizing those conversations, it can be quite difficult. But having said that, you know, there are times when to pick the time to look when the person is not, which is why being in the office is often better than being remote in some ways. You could spot when it might be the right point to talk to someone, to open up a discussion, because you can see what's happening. They maybe haven't got 3 phones ringing and they haven't got this, and you could just come and say, just want to have a quick word. So picking your time as well as picking the individual can be important. But I do have to say, leaders do need to create a culture to enable this to happen. And if they don't, it is very difficult.
Thank you. I think, yeah, creating that space is so important. And one thing that we do in our team meetings is we have kind of regular huddles throughout the week. And at the start, our manager, our team lead will ask us to tell us, give her a score out of 10 on how we're feeling. And you can quite easily kind of sense check kind of how others in the team are feeling and vocalize how you're feeling and give context to kind of perhaps kind of workload, mood, personal experiences, situations. So I found that really helpful.
In fact, within Deloitte, there's I'm not sure if it's universally applied, but it's applied in quite a few projects across Deloitte. A manual of me, it was called, which is really at the beginning of a big project, everybody putting down really kind of what makes them tick. You know, I really like it when this is important to me. When this kind of thing happens, I'm not so good. And just by having that kind of manual of how we all tick at the beginning can be a really, really good base when you're starting a project to understand where an individual's and where team boundaries are and people having a. And that has worked really, really effectively in a number of projects I've seen. Manual of me, I like the word. I like the wording.
I like that as well. That sounds great.
How I tick. You know.
Mel, perhaps this is a question for you. Someone's asked, through the recruitment and onboarding process, is there something your organisation could have done that would have supported you in feeling empowered to set boundaries?
That's a good question. So they're asked, the question is about setting boundaries when you're doing the onboarding and recruitment. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's from the start for the manager to set expectations, and the expectation as someone who's just recently onboarded. So, I mean, at least for us, onboarding usually lasts 2 weeks, is for them to be a sponge and absorb everything they can, and that it's okay to make mistakes. And for them to, you know, take everything lightly and really enjoy the journey, and then not to take not to put so much pressure on yourself. So that's definitely something that we are working on, and to have all the management on board, and also prepare like breakfast with the team to really build that team. And they also have mentors, so they can also, and mentees, so they can ask for advice from different departments.
Thank you, Mel. John, another question's come through, and I think this would be a good one to ask you. Someone has asked, how is it possible to manage good mental health and well-being, particularly in industries like the financial services, where the hours are often long and you can be working, into early hours of the morning or on the weekends?
I mean, I think it's always best to start with a kind of realism before moving to what can be done. I mean, and I'm not starry-eyed about the fact that although there's been great progress made in the conversations that we're having and the sort of things we've been talking about, there's still a lot that hasn't changed around the ingrained working practices that sit within a lot of financial institutions, within a lot of professional services outfits and law firms, that there is still a lack of challenge to what's actually perhaps a better way to get people to thrive and survive in the business to survive than absolutely long hours culture. So there is a way to go there, and it is a problem. And I don't want to not say that. I think that needs to be there, and it's one of the challenges for City Mental Health Alliance is to get organisations to challenge properly some of their working practices, to recognise that there are some things that they do which do not create a mentally healthy workplace, and that maybe there's a different way of doing these things. Sorry to get my soapbox, but I think it's important that we say that it's not all down to the individual to adapt to the situation. Some of it, the organisations need to think about unhealthy practices and the leadership of them. Having said that, there are matters of degree to which we can ensure that we are not picking up and adding to the pressure by the way we think about that environment. I'd go back a little bit to those kind of must, have to, and can't. There are so many that those words are thrown about. You listen to it all over the place. This is a must-win bid. This has to be in by 1 minute past 9 Tuesday morning, exactly like this. People will say that all around us. They'll use that language. It's lazy and it's not true. And if we can just actually start to recognise that sometimes when we're hearing you've got to be in the office tonight till 11. Standing back and recognising that there is often another way of dealing with this, that the truth is that the must and the have to, can't isn't as true as it seems. That if I exercise a choice not to do it, actually the world often doesn't fall in to anywhere near the degree we think it will. So I would encourage people to just challenge, and therefore, I'm going to take a drink of this tea because
No, please do.
I would encourage people to understand that those words, when they're used, often aren't as true. The person saying them is often, if you really not challenging them themselves, and to question a little bit, is there not another way of doing it? I noticed you said we have to do that. Is that all of it? Could we do this part of it by Monday? And not to assume that the person spraying those words around has actually thought it through. They very often are just passing a rigid demand down the line that someone at the top says, the client says this has to be in on Monday, and the partner passes it to the director who says, I'll find someone else and tell the manager this has to be in on Monday. And some poor person at the bottom of that chain is left with this rigid demand, and no one has interrogated it along the line. Very often, if one's talked to the client, if the partner had talked to the client, we find the client actually said, well, no, we don't actually have to have all of it. We could do this or we could do. So having the confidence to recognise the world probably won't fall in if we challenge a bit, that people, when they use those words, are often using them in a lazy way. They often haven't challenged it themselves. And often if you do have the conversation, it exposes the fact that there is another way of dealing with a situation. Not always, not 100% of the time, but actually some of the time. So there's some thoughts there about how one can, you know, make sure that we're navigating that landscape where everyone's using those words at you all the time.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I think we have time for one more question. And Will, perhaps this is a question for you. Someone has said that they'd be interested to hear on your thoughts and advice for junior staff in the team in setting boundaries with senior members of staff, either within their own team or in other teams.
Yeah, of course, happy to talk about that. I think similar to John, I think the first point I would make stepping back is, as far as possible, the role of senior people is to make sure that their younger staff members feel comfortable talking to them about challenges that they have. So kind of outside of this question, I think it's really important to set the tone from the very beginning of someone's career that well-being conversations are workplace conversations, and talking about your mental health within the office is something normal. It's something you should be talking about when times are good and you're having a really good time. It's something you should be talking about when things are a little less good as well. So I do really think the tone should be set from the top. That said, obviously we're in an imperfect world. Not every single manager is going to be doing that, especially not yet, although it's a world I would like to see. And so one bit of advice I have for junior people, if they maybe are struggling to kind of have these conversations, would come from my own personal experience. So I found that early on in my career, I found it hard to raise questions around my workload because I had this kind of thought in the back of my head, maybe my complaints aren't valid, maybe this thing that I'm struggling with isn't something I should be struggling with, maybe I should just be getting on with it. And something that I have found really helped me over time is, rather than, you know, going straight up to your manager and saying, I think this demand is unreasonable, I kind of wasn't able to do that. So I wanted a little bit of kind of external validation to help me feel more comfortable. So I identified quite quickly some people within my workplace who weren't necessarily in my chain of command, but were more senior and more experienced. And I would kind of take my concerns to them in a more relaxed setting first and say, you know, I'm struggling with XYZ. What do you think about this? Never have I raised the concern about my workload with someone and they have said, you're an idiot, you shouldn't be struggling with that. The response is always very, very helpful for me. It's people saying, you know, oh, that sounds really difficult, maybe you could approach it like this. And for me, getting that kind of secondary, more relaxed external validation to the kind of concerns that I was having has always made it much easier for me to then start a conversation with my manager. In certain cases, and it hasn't happened with me, in certain cases within the workplace, I think it can also be that kind of intermediate person can then go directly to the manager themselves if you would prefer that. So, you know, if you're very new to the workplace, say you're an apprentice or you're an intern or something like that, then maybe you just don't feel able to have those conversations with managers at all. Do lean on people around you who feel more like your peers and less like your managers to help you with that. It's definitely not something that you have to do alone.
Thanks, Will. I think that those are some really great tips to end our panel discussion on. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to Will, Mel and John. You have shared so many really useful examples and experiences, so thank you. And also thank you to those who are attending. I hope that you found this panel discussion useful, and I hope you'll be joining us for future Thriving from the Start Network events. If you're not already a member, please do sign up. We'll put the link in the chat. And thank you for joining. We hope to see you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank